There are moments in life when the heart takes you places the mind cannot follow. Moments where you stand at a crossroads, one path paved with desire, the other with guilt. But what happens when both paths lead to heartbreak? This is the story of a love that was never meant to be, a love whispered in silence and hidden in shadows, where every glance felt like a promise and every thought became a torment. Imagine being drawn to someone like a moth to a flame, knowing full well the fire isn't yours to touch. It begins innocently enough, a simple smile, a shared laugh, the kind of connection that feels rare in a world so chaotic. But then, the realization comes, sharp as glass, they belong to someone else. And yet, you can't look away. You can't stop feeling what you know you shouldn't. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispers that you're overstepping, that this road can only end in pain. But the heart, stubborn as it is, clings to hope. Hope for a love that can't exist. Hope for a future that was never written. And so you stay, trapped in the in-between, a world where dreams collide with reality and where every stolen moment feels both euphoric and unbearable. This is the kind of love that steals sleep, that turns every quiet moment into a battlefield of emotions. It isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, but it takes root, quietly weaving its way through your every thought, leaving you questioning who you are and what you truly want. And still, you tell yourself it will pass, that this ache is temporary. But what if it isn't? What if the pain is the only constant? And the only way to escape is to let go of the one thing that feels like it's keeping you alive? Her name is Claire. Quiet, observant, the kind of person who notices the things others overlook. She's the kind of soul who keeps to herself, yet has a warmth about her that pulls people in. But inside, Claire often feels like she's floating. Disconnected, unsure, searching for something she can't quite name. She's the friend who listens, the colleague who helps, the stranger who smiles. But in all those roles, she feels alone. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when she believed she could love, when the idea of connection felt simple, but life, as it often does, had other plans. Her relationships never seemed to fit. Either they were with people who didn't understand her, or with those who didn't care to. And so Claire retreated, choosing solitude over the messiness of love. She convinced herself that she was fine, that she could be content on her own, but sometimes late at night, in the quiet moments when the world fell away, she couldn't help but feel the emptiness. It was at work of all places where she first met him, Ethan. Charismatic, confident, the kind of man who makes everyone feel like they matter. He had this way of making even the most mundane tasks seem important. His kindness wasn't forced, it was effortless, and that was something Claire hadn't realized she needed until she saw it in him. There was something magnetic about Ethan, something that made her heart quicken when he smiled, when he remembered her name, when his eyes lingered just a moment too long. They first spoke in passing, just a few words exchanged over coffee one early morning. But there was an energy, an unspoken understanding that neither could ignore. Ethan's laughter was warm, genuine. He spoke with an ease that made Claire feel comfortable, even though she'd spent her life hiding her true thoughts. She'd always been careful, too careful. But with Ethan, it felt like something big was slowly taking root. It didn't take long for Claire to realize what was happening. She started to notice things, how Ethan would always find an excuse to talk to her, how he looked at her with a softness she hadn't seen in anyone else. He wasn't like the others. And as days passed, she felt herself falling into something she knew she couldn't have. Every shared laugh, every gentle conversation, every accidental brush of his fingers against hers, built a bridge she was too afraid to cross. But there was something Claire couldn't ignore. Ethan had a partner. She didn't know much about them, but it didn't take long to see the way Ethan's eyes softened when he talked about them. The way he spoke about their future, how they planned trips together, how his smile brightened when he shared a story about their life. Claire tried not to notice, she tried not to care, but every time Ethan's name was spoken in relation to someone else, a cold weight pressed on her chest. Claire, Claire, Claire. She knew from the start. Ethan wasn't hers. And deep down, she understood the rules. It wasn't just wrong, it was impossible. The world had already given him someone else to love, and Claire had no place in that equation. But even as she recognized the truth, something inside her shifted. That knowing, that undeniable awareness, only made her feelings burn more fiercely, and that, she realized, was the cruelest part of it all. The way the heart could betray you, even when you knew the cost. Claire began to wonder, why was it always the ones we could never have that we wanted the most? It felt like a cruel joke, the kind life played on those who dared to dream. And yet, as much as she tried to push him out of her thoughts, as much as she convinced herself to let go, she couldn't. Ethan's presence lingered in every moment, a silent pull that grew stronger with each passing day. It was a silent, invisible war within her, the battle between what was right and what felt right. The heart so easily swayed by the gentlest of gestures, and the mind so determined to stay grounded in reality. Claire tried to walk away from it. She told herself it was just a crush, just a fleeting moment, but it wasn't. And the longer she stayed, the more impossible it became to ignore. But perhaps the most painful part wasn't the desire itself. It was the waiting, the never-ending cycle of knowing, of wishing, of longing. And every moment she spent with Ethan, no matter how innocent it seemed, only added another layer to the weight she carried. And so Claire found herself in the quietest of places, right next to Ethan, yet a million miles away. The heart, as fragile and relentless as it is, had already made its choice. But the question remained, what could she do with a love that could never be hers? Every day, Claire watched them, Ethan and his partner, laughing, talking, sharing moments that were theirs alone. She couldn't stop seeing them together, no matter how much she tried to look away. There was a quiet kind of agony in it, watching someone you love with someone else. It was the kind of pain that didn't scream, it just stayed, a heavy weight lodged in her chest, constant and unyielding. She told herself it was wrong, that she had no right to feel what she did. But the heart didn't care about right or wrong. It only knew what it wanted. In those moments, when she watched from a distance, Claire could feel the guilt twisting inside her. A knot formed in her stomach, sharp and tight. She knew that the space between them was more than physical. It was an invisible barrier, one that was never meant to be crossed. And yet, with every glance, with every small interaction, the walls seemed to grow thinner. She couldn't help herself. She wanted to be there. She wanted to be the one making him smile like that, to be the one he leaned on. But she didn't deserve that. She knew that. The rational part of her, the part that had always tried to stay grounded, kept telling her to let go, to accept the boundaries that were clearly drawn. But the heart never listened. Late at night, Claire would sit alone, questioning herself. Why couldn't she just let it go? Why did she keep hoping when she knew the truth? She'd stare at her phone, wondering what it would be like to text him, just to hear his voice, even if only for a moment. And then the guilt would rush in, suffocating her. She'd erase the message before it was even typed, convincing herself that it was for the best. But there was always that whisper, the one that told her she could have more, if only she was brave enough. Her friend Sarah had warned her, "Claire, you need to move on. It's not worth it." But those words, as well-meaning as they were, didn't reach her. Not really. No one could make her stop feeling what she felt, and Sarah's advice only made her feel more isolated, like the one person who might understand was turning away. Why is it so easy for everyone else to let go? Claire thought, her mind racing. But Sarah couldn't see the way Ethan made her feel, the way he made her feel seen in a way no one else had. And then there were the moments when Ethan would speak to her, his voice kind, his words gentle, a compliment here, a simple question there, little things that fed her hope, that made her think maybe, just maybe, he felt something too. But those moments never lasted. They were fleeting, like drops of water in a desert, quickly absorbed into the reality that he belonged to someone else. Still, Claire couldn't help but hold on to them. His laughter, his warm gaze, the way his presence seemed to wrap around her in the briefest of exchanges. But how long could she keep pretending? How long could she ignore the truth that her feelings for him were pushing her further away from herself? Every time they spoke, every time she allowed herself to dream of something that couldn't be, she lost a piece of her dignity, a piece of her self-respect. One day it happened, a simple slip of the tongue. It wasn't even anything grand or dramatic, just a phrase, a quiet confession that slipped out before she could catch it. A comment about how happy she was for Ethan, how much she admired him. But something in her tone gave it away, something that told him more than she had intended. Ethan paused, just for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to piece something together. "Are you sure you're just happy for me, Claire?" he asked, his voice light, but there was an edge to it now, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Claire's heart dropped. She could feel the weight of his words press against her chest, suffocating her in a way she couldn't explain. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, desperately trying to cover the truth, but it was already too late. For a moment it felt like everything went still. Ethan didn't say anything more, but there was an unease between them, a shift she couldn't ignore. He wasn't foolish. He had to have known, at least on some level, what Claire had been trying to hide. Claire's mind raced. She had never meant to reveal how deep her feelings ran. She had kept them locked away, buried under layers of forced smiles and empty small talk. But now the truth was there, out in the open. And she could feel the weight of it, a burden she wasn't sure how to carry anymore. That night she lay awake, heart pounding as guilt gnawed at her. She hadn't just hurt herself, she had put Ethan in a position where he had to confront something that should never have existed. She had made him question his own boundaries, his own commitment. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she regretted it. The days that followed were unbearable. Claire tried to act normal, to pretend nothing had changed. But every interaction with Ethan felt charged, like the air before a storm. It wasn't just her anymore, it was Ethan's partner too. They noticed. They saw the way Ethan would look at Claire when she least expected it, how they would exchange brief, tense glances when they thought no one was looking. And then it happened. The confrontation, sharp and uncomfortable, between Claire and Ethan's partner. They knew, they could see it, see the tension, the unspoken truth between Claire and Ethan. The words were simple, but they hit like a punch. "I don't know what's going on with you and Ethan, but if you care about this friendship at all, you'll step back. You'll let him go." And there it was, the choice. The ultimatum Claire had been avoiding. Would she confess everything to Ethan and risk tearing apart the delicate balance of their friendship? Or would she walk away quietly, burying her feelings for good? I thought telling the truth might set me free. But the truth has a way of breaking more than it heals. Sometimes, when you speak the truth, it shatters the very foundation of everything you've built. And in that moment, Claire knew There would be no easy way out. There comes a point when the weight of unspoken words becomes unbearable, when the silence between you and the one you care about grows too loud to ignore. For Claire, that moment had arrived. She could no longer pretend that her feelings for Ethan were just a fleeting thing, something she could shove into the corners of her heart. She had to speak. Not to win him over, not to change anything, but to release herself from the chains she had so carefully wrapped around her heart. It wasn't a grand confession. There were no dramatic words or declarations. It was simple, honest. In the quiet of a moment alone, when the world seemed to slow down, Claire turned to Ethan and said what she had never dared to say before. "I've had feelings for you. For a long time now. I know it's wrong. I know you're with someone else, and I respect that. But I needed you to know. I needed to let it go." Ethan's face softened, and for a moment the air between them was thick with emotion. His eyes met hers, not with surprise, but with recognition. He didn't look angry or upset. Instead, there was a quiet sadness in his gaze, as if he had known all along but had never dared to say anything. He took a slow breath, as if gathering his own thoughts, before responding with a voice that was steady yet tender. "Claire," he said, his voice warm but firm, "I'm flattered, truly, but I'm with someone, I'm committed to them, and that hasn't changed. I care about you, but not in the way you're hoping for." There was no judgment in his words, no harshness. Just the simple truth. And in that moment, something shifted in Claire. It wasn't the outcome she had wanted. It wasn't the answer her heart had longed for, but it was the answer she needed. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't in months. Relief. It wasn't the end she had imagined. There were no passionate farewells, no tear-filled confessions that rewrote the course of their lives. What happened instead was a quiet acknowledgement between two people who understood the limits of their connection. There was no animosity, no bitterness, just a shared understanding that the love Claire had felt was one-sided, and that was okay, because sometimes love isn't about possession. Claire stood there, looking into Ethan's eyes, and for the first time, she truly saw him, not as a dream, not as a fantasy, but as a person who was living his own life, with his own choices, his own path. And she realized, truly realized, that her heart had been holding on to something that wasn't hers to keep. It was a painful truth, but it was also freeing. After that conversation, Claire walked away, not with a heart full of regret, but with a heart that was learning to heal. She didn't have all the answers, she didn't know what her future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she understood something essential. Her worth wasn't defined by another person's love. Her happiness, her sense of self, didn't depend on being chosen, it depended on choosing herself. As she reflected on the journey she had taken, through the longing, the self-doubt, the quiet battles within herself, she realized that this had been a lesson. A painful one, yes, but necessary. She had learned about boundaries, about self-respect, and about the strength it took to walk away from something that could never be hers. She had learned that sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is walk away. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough to let go. The days that followed were not easy, but Claire found herself in places she hadn't been before. In moments of self-discovery, in acts of kindness toward herself, in the quiet moments where she began to reclaim the parts of her she had neglected. Slowly, she rebuilt. Slowly, One day, as she walked down a familiar street, the sun warm on her face, Claire stopped. She paused for a moment, letting the light wash over her, letting the weight she had been carrying begin to lift. She knew that there was still work to do, that healing wasn't a straight line, but it was a path worth taking, the path of self-love, of acceptance, of choosing to walk away from the things that didn't serve her, and walking toward the person she was becoming. And as she continued down that street, her steps were lighter. Her heart, while still tender, was no longer heavy with what could never be. She didn't need anyone else to define her happiness anymore. She was enough as she was. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest gift she could give her. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting go. Because we all deserve someone who is completely ours, just as we are theirs. And as Claire walked forward, she knew she was one step closer to finding that person. Not in someone else, but in herself. Sometimes love isn't about holding on, it's about learning when to let go. And that journey, the one where we confront our own hearts and our own boundaries, is never easy. But it's also where we find our strength. The kind of strength that doesn't come from holding on to something that isn't meant for us, but from walking away when it hurts the most, knowing that we deserve more. We deserve a love that is fully ours, just as we are fully someone else's. But there are so many of us who find ourselves in those same shadows, longing for someone who can't be ours. And if you're watching this, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've loved someone you couldn't have, and you've wrestled with the pain of letting go. I want to hear your story. Have you ever loved someone you couldn't have? How did you find the strength to let go, to move on, to heal? I invite you to share your journey in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear, the encouragement someone else needs to find their own courage. We're all connected by our experiences, by our hearts that break and mend, and by the lessons we learn along the way. By sharing, we open up spaces for healing, for understanding, and for the kind of community that reminds us we're never truly alone in our pain. And if you're looking for more stories of emotional journeys, of healing, of self-discovery, of finding the strength to move on, don't forget to subscribe. Join us for more stories that explore the heart's complexities, the hard lessons, and the beautiful moments that come after the storm.